Alrighty, welcome to this episode of Lectures with Liddington. Last episode we talked about bioenergetics and how cells utilize energy. So in this episode we're going to talk about the first of those two processes, and that is photosynthesis. Photosynthesis, this is how autotrophs or producers get their energy. So remember, autotrophs are self-feeders, so things like plants, some protists, and some bacteria are capable of doing photosynthesis. So you need to remember this equation. It is very important that you know the equation for photosynthesis in order to be able to understand what's happening. It's also going to set us up for what comes next, which is cellular respiration. But you need to know what goes into photosynthesis and what comes out. What goes in, these are my reactants. And what comes out, these are my products. So in photosynthesis, I take light from the sun. I combine that with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, water from the roots. They go into the chloroplast, which we'll talk about. And I do a bunch of different processes, and out pumps glucose, which is a form of chemical energy, C6H12O6, and oxygen. This is that gas that plants release that we are able to breathe in. We're recycling, right? We're recycling gases between plants and animals, between producers and us animals. What you'll notice, just going to sort of foreshadow a little bit here, what you're going to notice is cellular respiration, those products and reactants are flipped. They're the opposite. So what comes out of photosynthesis goes in to cellular respiration. And what comes out of cellular respiration goes into photosynthesis. So they're going to look very similar. But remember, in photosynthesis, carbon dioxide and water, with help from light energy, are converted into glucose and oxygen. So where does this exciting process happen? Well, the chloroplast. Except for in bacteria, they have their own way of doing this. But in eukaryotes, this occurs in the chloroplast. The chloroplast is pretty cool. It is specialized for photosynthesis. It has two membranes. Within the inside, what we have, that cytoplasm, when we talk about cells, there's what we call cytoplasm. Inside, that is called the stroma. So the stroma is the goo on the inside of that inner membrane. Notice we have our outer membrane here, and then the inner membrane here. And then the goo that holds everything in place is the stroma. Within that stroma, you have these little stacks. And the stacks are called thylakoids. There's thylakoid here. So this little guy is a thylakoid. And then this whole stack of thylakoids is called a grana or granum. Granum is granum is one, grana is multiple. I said it backwards. So here we have a granum of thylakoids. So it looks like coins, right? So maybe that's help, right? Thylakoids, thylacoins in a stack. That stack is a granum. And why am I talking about this? Because I'm going to start telling you about some different processes that occur during photosynthesis, two different types of reactions, and understanding the layout of a chloroplast is going to become very important. So let's remind ourselves, photosynthesis, we need to know this equation. Light energy comes in, I bring in carbon dioxide and water, and out pumps glucose and oxygen. So I foreshadowed this a little bit. There are two different stages of photosynthesis, and those are the light dependent and light independent reactions. So what's really going on in these two different processes? So my light-dependent reactions, these occur generally first, sort of down the line, depending at what point photosynthesis is. But light-dependent reactions, we refer to them this way because they need light. And these occur in the thylakoids. So in those stacks of the coins, right, the thylakoids, in those little stacks, our light-dependent reactions occur because this is where that chlorophyll is actually housed. And remember back when we watched Amoeba Sisters, they said that chlorophyll is a pigment, and that's the pigment that provides plants with that green coloring. And it's essential in order for the plant to harness that light energy. So there are four sort of major components of these light-dependent reactions and what's actually happening. So what happens first is that plant pulls the water up from its roots and sends it to those cells that are responsible for photosynthesizing. It pulls that water up. The water goes into those thylakoids, and the energy from the sun will actually split it. And what happens is you cut off one of those hydrogens and oxygen is released off. Or excuse me, you cut off those hydrogens and oxygen is released. The next thing that happens is, so now you have those extra hydrogens. Well, those extra hydrogens will pop onto what's called NADP. It will become NADPH. Essentially, this is a molecule involved in carting protons and electrons back and forth where they're needed. Then, remember our friend ATP. Now I make ATP. So I take my ADP, I pop on a phosphate, and I send ATP out. So next, I have my light-independent reactions, also known as Calvin cycle, sometimes referred to as dark reactions, but let's not use that. I don't really like that terminology because it's not necessarily that it needs to be in the dark. It just could occur in the dark. It just doesn't depend on light. So it's light-independent is a better way of phrasing it. So they do not require light. They can occur regardless of the presence of light. And these actually occur in the stroma. So this is that goo on the outside of those thylakoids. So what happens is there's sort of two pieces that occur here. One of those things is carbon dioxide comes in. Right? So carbon dioxide that the leaves have pulled in, that carbon dioxide comes in and it joins with the hydrogens from that NADPH. Notice I've got H's here. So I pull a bunch of H's off those NADPHs and I pop them onto these CO2s. It's called fixing. So I fix that carbon dioxide and I make glucose, C6H12O6. Right, notice I've got carbons and oxygens in my CO2 and then I have H's. So I do some rearranging and I pump out that glucose. Now, because I've done that, I have freed up NADP to head over to those thylakoids to go back into those light-dependent reactions. And now I take that ATP and I release the energy. Right? I chop off that phosphate and I end up with ADP and phosphate. So I release that energy from that ATP in order to undergo this process. So what does this look like in sort of a nice overarching illustration? Well, here's my sun. Right? So my light energy goes into my thylakoids, and my water comes in. So my water, my H2O comes in, and I split it. And out goes O2. Out from here, remember I have my ATP, I make ATP, and NADPH. So my ATP gets produced and my NADPH get made. They pump out, they come out of the thylakoid, they go into the stroma. Now they're available in the stroma to help these light independent reactions. So my CO2 goes in to the stroma. With the help of NADPH, it gets fixed and out pumps C6H12O6 or glucose. I've now locked an H off of that NADPH, and I break a phosphate off ATP, and now all those can filter back into my thylakoids. So my ADP plus P and then NADP are both available to go back into the thylakoids to support those light-dependent reactions. So we have this great cycling of ATP and NADPH that allow these two processes to work in harmony. So my water comes in, O2 goes out. Carbon dioxide goes in, glucose goes out. Notice I have one of my reactants goes in and one of the products comes out. My other reactant goes in and the other product comes out. So with these two pieces together, we have the entirety of photosynthesis. So let's take a minute, press pause, and do a little review.